All right, so I want to take a quick aside and discuss the playoff situation. Let's go a few minutes on that because I think it's particularly valuable discussion right now, given where Ohio State and Oklahoma are going to fall. I said today that after what I saw versus Michigan, because Michigan's still a good football team, Michigan's not garbage just because they got blown out by Ohio State. I've been consistent in killing Ohio State for that Purdue loss and killing Ohio State last year for the Iowa loss because I don't think championship caliber teams lose to anybody by 3 or 4 touchdowns except maybe the elite teams. But right now, if I had a ballot, and I do not, if I had a vote, and I do not, I would have Ohio State actually third and Notre Dame fourth. But let's take the third thing off the table and just say between Oklahoma and Ohio State, who's getting in. I think it's a perfectly fair discussion point to say, okay, let's look at this loss. Let's look at Oklahoma's loss to Texas. It was close. Let's look at Ohio State's loss to a crappy Purdue team, and it was a blowout. I think that is a completely fair discussion. Last year, that's not the discussion Ohio State fans wanted to have. They only wanted to talk about their wins versus Alabama wins, which is in isolation. But if I'm consistent in last year saying you've got to talk about the Ohio State loss and not just the win, then I'm going to do the flip and be consistent and say you can't just talk about the loss. All of it matters. And Ohio State's win, what we saw yesterday, really matters. And here's the problem I have, and I'm going to let you kind of go off on this too. The problem I have is when you see these side-by-side resume comparisons, it's always like 2 top 50 wins or 4 top 25 wins or whatever it is. And, here's the one loss they had was to a top 10 team or whatever. And then they throw out FPI, strength of schedule. All these numbers are like aggregate numbers. They never look at the scores of the actual games. And both of these teams have these close wins against crappy teams or not elite teams. So that's kind of a wash. What you have, and it boils down to, in my opinion, what you have is Oklahoma's side, you have the loss is in their favor because Texas is a better loss than Purdue. But the win is not just a number 4 win where West Virginia, I think 13 is the best win for Oklahoma. The win is not just a number 4 win. It's a dump trucking over your biggest rival where you scored 60-some points. I think we have to look at more than just the resume in aggregate and look at actual scores and then decide what that means about which team is better. It's a long open to this quick discussion, so I'm sorry I ran long, but I wanted to talk about it, so let me get your thoughts on that as well.
I think it's fair, and we've talked about this a lot. How do you evaluate wins and losses? How do you evaluate strength of schedule? We've gotten to the point where we almost hate to bring up strength of schedule. We have to a lot when you have these big games because, especially if it's an out of conference game, anything our models doing or anything when you compare these teams play in isolation now. A lot of times they're in different divisions or they've played different sets of teams. Schedule is inherent to everything in college football, and the way you evaluate a team. If the Big Ten's a lot better than the Big 12, then close games in the Big Ten obviously are a lot more forgivable than a close game in the Big 12. It's important, and I think one of the issues is, like you said, drawing these arbitrary lines on how many top 40 teams have you played, how many top 60 teams, how many top 20 teams. You can get a little screwy when you do that. That one, you can do the fan thing and draw the line at what's convenient for you and the point you want to make. And two, I think it gets really, really easy. Like you talked about, that you can look at and say, okay, who has the worst loss? All right, well, we have the best loss. They have the worst loss. We should be in. Or you can look in isolation at just win loss record, a 2 loss, and that really doesn't come into the playoffs too much. But you could say, well, we're undefeated and they've got a loss. That's the UCF argument, and ignore the strength of schedule overall and say, well, why does that? So anybody would be undefeated with that season schedule. Or you can look at who has the best wins, which maybe that's just a function of playing a harder schedule than another team, that they didn't have the opportunity to have. Especially that gets really bad when you talk about, say, top 10 wins, that, well, maybe this other team had 4 wins between top 10 and top 25, and you happen to have had two top 10 wins and played nobody else of any consequence. So it's all really complicated. The way I've always wanted to look at it is I see how you did against your schedule. I see how that team did against their schedule. Let me try to gauge how your team would do against each other's schedule. How would Ohio State look? And based off their season, how would Ohio State look against Oklahoma's schedule? How would Oklahoma look at us against Ohio State's schedule? You factor in things like the Purdue loss, and you say Ohio State could have a bad day and lose to a Purdue. How would that have happened with Oklahoma's schedule? And you factor in Oklahoma's schedule and say, okay, they lost to Texas, and their close win is over, West Virginia, who was highly ranked but not extremely highly ranked, and they gave up 56 points in that game. How would that do against Ohio State's schedule? This year, I think that's an extremely difficult discussion because you look at Oklahoma, one score win over Army, lost to Texas, one score win over Texas Tech, one score win over Oklahoma State, one score win over West Virginia. It's not just like they lost to Texas. I mean, they were in close games against pretty mediocre teams repeatedly this season. The problem is Ohio State, from an objective outsider's perspective, has the same issue from a scheduling perspective. That one score win over Nebraska looks really bad. One score win over Maryland looks really bad. Early in the season, you have a one-score win over Penn State that looks pretty forgivable, but Penn State is not as strong a team as they were. If you look at the TCU game, which is a common opponent between the two, let me see here. Oklahoma won by 25, and Ohio State won by 12. So that kind of favors Oklahoma in that one margin, but you're still talking 2 to 4 touchdown, sort of comfortable, but not necessarily utterly dominant win. It's pretty even. I think I hedge a little more. I hedge a little more towards saying, there's nothing on Oklahoma's schedule that makes me think they would lose to a Purdue. They haven't done that at any point this year. But I also will hedge to the fact to say there is nothing on Oklahoma's schedule that tells me that they could beat a Michigan. And I think Michigan's particular problems probably would show up against Oklahoma, everything we had discussed earlier. But Oklahoma hasn't done anything to that extent. And I think I don't think Oklahoma could stop anybody, including Michigan, from scoring. So it's a tough discussion. I don't even know how it comes out right now, honestly. I think Oklahoma, Texas is going to make that discussion to a certain extent. And I think if Oklahoma, even if they play a close game against Texas, it's going to be a real argument between these two teams. But if Oklahoma blows out Texas, I think they're going to be in over Ohio State.
So the TCU data point is interesting to me because yes, Oklahoma, and look, I'm not coming into this. Look, I'm not an Oklahoma fan, Ohio State fan. I'm pretty objective on this because I don't have a dog in the fight. I think that the TCU game is interesting because TCU was still undefeated when they played Ohio State. They had a lot to play for. TCU already had 3 losses by the time they played Oklahoma, and they were a little bit defeated. Right after Oklahoma beat them, they lost to Kansas. So that's a little bit different team in my opinion. But really, to me, the thing that it kind of boils down to, and I do agree with you, like if Ohio State struggles with Northwestern or Oklahoma struggles with Texas, even though Texas is a better team, Texas has already beaten them. The thing that I see on these two teams' schedules is, one, Oklahoma only got one decent team on their schedule, in my opinion, or one really good team. I think West Virginia's a good team. Ohio State has shown that they can blow out a good team. Oklahoma has not shown that they can blow out a good team. All of the decent teams they've played, they've either lost to in Texas or have played within one score. And we're talking about like a Texas Tech team that got destroyed by a terrible Ole Miss team. So we have that knowledge of Texas Tech. They blew out Kansas State, but so did Mississippi State. So they had an opportunity, granted it was on the road, to really create some separation with West Virginia and show that they're about as good as a West Virginia. So for me, between these two schedules, the only one that shows me that in a fight against an elite team, the only one that has the potential to win that game, to me, is Ohio State. I think Oklahoma's as bad as Ohio State. I've been on them about their defense this year. I don't think the whole thing is bad. I don't think it's they can't tackle. I don't think it's guys are open by 100 yards. It's It's a couple of positions that are being exposed. The whole is there something there with we've only seen between these two teams, only one of them not only has the opportunity or has shown that they're good enough to beat a good team like Michigan, but the only one that's shown they're good enough to blow out a good team like
I think
Michigan.
there is. I think what we saw from Ohio State in that game was really on both sides of the ball that they were able to play big boy football, step up, and blow a team out and control a football game. And like to your point, Oklahoma has not controlled the football game against any high level opponent. And when I say high level, I don't mean top 10, but any good opponent all season. And Ohio State has struggled off and on, and it's a valid ding against Ohio State when you're making these considerations when you're at the playoff level. They haven't dominated teams to the extent that they have in recent years, but they have at least dominated one. They've shown the ability to win in a big game and to control it and to play at the kind of level you need to play at to win the playoff. It's such a hard discussion. And I think the shame of it really, if you're an Ohio State fan, is, and you talked about this before in the Ohio State Michigan. I think you talked about it particularly when we were guests for Buckeye Grove. Ohio State fans felt like going to the Michigan game to a certain extent like they were a 9-3 team. Like they're very frustrated with the defense and frustrated with everything else. They'd only lost one game to Purdue, 49-20. It was a game that they were a better team than Purdue. They should have probably won that game, and they end up losing by 29. If they just play that game close, or if they manage to squeak out a 50-49 win, there's no doubt that they're in the playoff right now. And it's really difficult to gauge because it is a situation where you say Ohio State won a game they probably shouldn't have, or lost a game they shouldn't have lost. And how much do we punish Ohio State for the sake of punishing someone for losing a game? And how much do we pick the team that we think is the better team despite the fact that they lost that game because we think they probably would win it if they played again? And I don't know the answer to that, and I think that gets into your philosophy on who should or should not make the playoff in general.
So we've been critical of Alabama in terms of like this year saying if Alabama doesn't beat Georgia, maybe they shouldn't get in the playoffs. And that basically it's time for Alabama to handle their business. Is it time for us to say to Ohio State, okay, you want to be in the playoffs? Just don't lose a game by 30 points. Like, is that fair to say? Like, for all of the talent that they have and all of their ability to put it together in 2014 and have some great conference championships since then and winning Rose Bowls, is it too much to ask to just say, guys, don't lose by 30 to an unranked team and then none of this is a discussion? Because we're having to like hem and haw and look at little details of this whole thing. Just don't lose to Purdue by 30 and this isn't a discussion.
I think that's a fair point, and I do have a counter to it though. I think it's true that really when you get down to it, Ohio State just needs to not lose to bad or unranked teams by 3 to 5 touchdowns, right? If that doesn't happen, then you're going to get in the playoff the past couple of years, and we don't have to have these discussions. The problem is that only makes sense in complete isolation talking about Ohio State and not talking about the broader context. Obviously, if we say, all right, all we need is for you four of the 5 Power 5 champions to just go undefeated, win your conference title, and just take care of business, and you're making the playoff. That doesn't happen this year. It doesn't happen ever. And it's not going to probably happen. Maybe we'll see that at some point, but I can't think of a year where that's ever happened, where 4 of the 5 Power 5 teams, champions, all are undefeated in the same year. Everybody always has blemishes. And this was our discussion last year with Ohio State and Alabama, and we're going to see the same thing this year. You have to be really careful because if you want to say, well, you can't lose to an unranked team by 29 and make the playoff, well, that's fine and dandy. But you can't be Oklahoma and play 2 ranked teams all year and lose to one of them and make the playoff.
And barely
right?
beat the other one.
Right. The problem, we talked about this last year. The problem last year was neither Alabama nor Ohio State deserved to make the playoff. But you got to pick a fourth one. And it's a problem with this playoff expansion when you move to 4 teams. It would be a massive problem, in my opinion, if you move to 8. The problem is you stop picking teams that deserve to make the playoff. And at some extent, you're going to end up always having to pick a team or two. I say always, but you're frequently going to be pick a team or two where you're going to say, this team doesn't really deserve to make the playoff, but they're the fourth best team and they're the fourth most deserving team and they should be in the playoff. And the problem with that statement is it's how do you describe the word deserve? And everybody's basically what it comes down to your point about don't lose to an unranked team by 30. People say you don't deserve to win a national title unless you go undefeated or unless you have maybe one close loss to a top 15 team. That's kind of everybody's mindset. Well, you can feel that all you want, but that's not the system we have by any context. We say in this system, you deserve to win a national title if you're one of the 4 best teams and you win the playoff, period. That's how we set it. So if Ohio State is one of the 4 best teams, they deserve to be in. And I think that's the only metric you can use. And if you start trying to set outside metrics about, well, you can't do this and you can never do this and you can never do that, that's when you get in trouble because it's always relative to what you did on everybody else. It's just whether you're better than the other 126 teams in college football. And that's what matters in this discussion.
All right, so let's go 3 minutes on this, and then we're done, I swear. Based on what you just said, then, back to my original point that I said I was going to get into later, based on that, let's now take Oklahoma off the table and say that Ohio State is in the playoffs. I would argue that Ohio State has played their way into a 3rd seed over Notre Dame because Notre Dame doesn't have the loss, but 2 things. One, in aggregate, if we're talking about, over the course of the season, I think these constant 1-score games against teams that aren't even going to make a bowl or teams that are just really average, teams that are just okay. Southern Cal, I understand it's a rival, but they're 5-7 this year, and you beat them by 1 touchdown. You were down by 10 points in the game. You had to claw your way back. Alabama beat Southern Cal this year by 40 points. No questions asked. Alabama would beat Southern Cal this year by 40 points. And so how bad does Alabama beat Ball State? And the argument is, well, we didn't have Ian Book by then. Alabama could beat Ball State with their 3rd-string quarterback by 3 touchdowns. And their 3rd-string quarterback is not as good as Wimbush. So I think if you're going to your earlier point about saying how would a team do against another team's schedule, I don't know that Notre Dame is undefeated with Ohio State's schedule. Maybe they are. But I don't think Ohio State has 4 or 5 1-score wins against some of the teams that turned out to be pretty bad for Notre Dame. To their credit, they won all their games. And that's why I would fight to the death to say they deserve to be in, because every other team does have warts. We're not talking about 5 undefeated teams and then we get down into this detail. But we are talking about a team that has played a lot of close games against a lot of not great teams. And honestly, neutral field right now, Ohio State is probably a 15 to 17 point favorite over Notre Dame, which tells me it's not fair. I know. It's not fair for Alabama in the first game to have to play the better of the 2 teams in the 3rd and 4th seeds. What do you think?
I don't really have a particular argument with that point. And, we've talked about this a lot, like comparing one schedule to another. I mean, I know I'm hesitant to say it. That's why I'm sort of pausing. But we've talked a lot this year of how much strength of schedule matters because we've had some SEC, ACC matchups, and we've talked about a fair number of ACC games, and we've talked about some Notre Dame games. And I'm going to say it because it is my opinion. The ACC is ridiculously bad this year. And I don't really want to get into whether the SEC or the Big Ten is the better conference because I don't think it matters. All that matters in this discussion is the Big Ten is a hell of a lot better than the ACC. And the ACC is probably historically bad. I know in S&P, it's the worst the conference has ever been as far as it's been tracked. They're about 5 points worse in any average matchup between the ACC and any other Power 5 conference. That'd be almost a touchdown underdog. So when you look at, say, Notre Dame versus Ohio State schedule, one, to your point with those struggling wins with Ball State, would that happen if you were Notre Dame? I don't know that it would. Two, With this Michigan win and a total blowout against Michigan, can you point to any game on the Notre Dame schedule and tell me that Ohio State would have lost that game?
Well, you can't point to the Michigan game that Notre Dame played against Michigan, and that's their best win. I mean, I know transitive property, common opponents. It's often crap, but if we're looking at, let's give Notre Dame Ian Book and Dexter Williams in game one. Did they beat Michigan by 30 points? I don't think so. I mean, whatever Ohio State's going to do to Northwestern, what was the score of that Northwestern Michigan game? It wasn't a blowout.
Northwestern Notre Dame was 31-21.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not fair to Notre Dame completely, and I get it. This is all hypothetical. We don't have a vote, so we get to talk about this kind of crap. But today, does Alabama, as a 1 seed, would they rather play Ohio State or would they rather play Notre Dame? And I think there's two things that you look at. One, if they're both getting in, because we're back to best teams. We're not back to best, cleanest record. If they both get in, Notre Dame and Ohio State, who would be favored on a neutral field? And I'm going to let you answer both these questions. Who would be favored on a neutral field, and which one would Alabama rather play?
I think pretty clearly, I think Ohio State would be favored on a neutral field over Notre Dame. And I think Alabama would clearly prefer to play Notre Dame over Ohio State. And, it gets to a point that I made in another video this week. I mean, Notre Dame at this point, 1-score win over Ball State, Vanderbilt, 1-score win over Pitt, 1-score win over USC. These are not great teams. And I think this whole discussion on the 4th seed spot, and this is, I think, maybe where you're going with this whole thing. We have all this discussion of Oklahoma versus Ohio State to the 4th seed. To me, what it really highlights is how much we give inherent credit to going undefeated, regardless of record, regardless of how you've played against the schedule. I guess if you play a Power 5 schedule and you go undefeated, I guess the theory is you deserve to get in no matter what. But we have grappled all year hard, and we've taken a ton of heat in out-of-conference games, particularly the ACC, people playing ACC schedules, because we keep having to harp on schedule and evaluating teams. I don't think you can't just look at win-loss records. If Alabama loses to Georgia, we can have this whole discussion whether they should get in over or not, or Ohio State or Oklahoma. But to me, it's almost I don't even get to that point. I look at Notre Dame and I say, Alabama played a much more difficult schedule than Notre Dame did. They won all their games by 3+ touchdowns. They went 12-0 against that schedule in the regular season, the same record Notre Dame did. And now you want to kick Alabama out because they had to play a conference championship game against a top 5 team that's better than anyone Notre Dame played. And it's easy to say, well, they should because they've lost and they should play out. But we don't play into the playoff. The playoff is a self-contained thing where you pick the 4 best teams. And Alabama did the same thing Notre Dame did. They did it better against a harder schedule. They played an extra game, and now you're horribly punishing them for it. And that's before you even get to, well, what Ohio State do against Notre Dame's schedule. I think they'd go 12-0 too. So, and I think they do it a better job than Notre Dame did against that schedule. So I am with you. I think this year kind of highlights all the difficulties and differences that come into play when you make these playoff selections. I think it really highlights the fact that we put a tremendous amount of emphasis on win-loss record. We put a lot of emphasis on bad losses versus good wins. Bad losses being, do you lose to a bad team and how much do you lose by? And good wins being how well, do you beat top 5, top 10 teams? And unfortunately, with conferences expanding, conferences are a lot more isolated than they used to be. There aren't a lot of interconference data points. Notre Dame used to be the best data point, but now playing 5 or 6 games in the ACC, they're actually a little bit more isolated than they were before as well. So we've got, basically we're in a situation where teams, Clemson and Notre Dame had a completely different bar to clear than Ohio State. And while it's true that they could not have lost a game like Purdue and got in, that's because Ohio State had a much, much more difficult schedule. And it's just going to be incredibly difficult to make these decisions as long as that's the case.